Hello, and welcome back to Just the Facts, ma'am. This is episode number 7. Today is Friday, June 13th, 2025, and I have a very special guest who is near and dear to me. This is my brother, Eric Hall, and he's also a really accomplished attorney. And how do I know that? One, mom and dad don't stop talking about it. But even more importantly is he was recently not only listed in the Colorado's top attorneys, he was on the cover of the magazine. So welcome, Eric. Thank you for being here.
Thank you. It's nice to be here.
Okay, today's topic is freedom of speech. And part of the reason why it's such a treat to have Eric here is he is an expert in this. Eric, can you give us a little bit of a bio about your legal expertise?
Don't know if I'm an expert in freedom of speech, but I have some experience there. I've been a lawyer for 25 years, doing free speech work from the beginning and all the way through my legal career. Done a lot of free speech cases, litigated them, advised clients about them. So yeah, got some background there.
So before we dive into the specifics of the First Amendment, I thought it might be useful to give some background on really its origin story. Going back into American history, remember that in 1776, Thomas Jefferson was the principal author of the Declaration of Independence. And that was what the 13 original colonies declared independence from Britain to become original states. And then 11 years later, in 1787, at the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, 55 delegates from those 13 original states met to create the Constitution. James Madison is the principal author, and he is known as the father of the Constitution and also the fourth president of the US. That was signed that summer. It was ratified, meaning officially approved the following year. And then in 1789, it became official in terms of the government started functioning under rule of the Constitution. But James Madison, as the father of the Constitution, started writing some amendments, some constitutional amendments, because he wanted to really specify the protections of individual liberties. And those initial amendments, the first 10 specifically, became the Bill of Rights. And that was ratified in 1791. And the first of those 10 that we're going to talk about today, because free speech is included as a First Amendment right.
Okay, so with that background, let me read the text of the First Amendment. So the First Amendment says, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press or the right of the people to peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. So that's the First Amendment. And if you listen carefully, you could hear the various, what's called maybe the 5 freedoms that come out of that, one of which being the freedom of speech.
Okay, in layman's terms, how would you describe what freedom of speech protects?
So what's important to understand about the freedom of speech is it protects the people from the government abridging their speech. So that's the important thing. And I'm going to emphasize 2 things there. One, it's the freedom of the people. So it's all the people within the jurisdiction of the federal government. And 2, it's their protection from the government. Not from private parties, but from the government abridging their ability to speak freely.
So a point of clarification, when you say it's the people within U.S. jurisdiction, is that dependent on their citizenship status?
No, it's not. It's just anyone, citizen or non-citizen, has the protection of the First Amendment.
Okay, so that's a layman's understanding. What is a more sophisticated or legal understanding of the bedrock principles of freedom of speech?
So let me touch on 4. The first one is the one I just mentioned, which is the first thing people need to understand is that the freedom of speech from the First Amendment protects the people from the government censoring, affecting their ability to speak freely. So that's the first one. The second one is no viewpoint discrimination. What that means is bedrock principle of the First Amendment, of the Free Speech Clause specifically, is that the government cannot discriminate between certain viewpoints. So it can't take sides in who gets to speak. So it can't say, oh, well, we want Republicans to speak, or we want Democrats to speak, but not vice versa. Or it can't say we want religious people to have more ability to speak, or we want non-religious people to have more ability to speak than religious people. It can't take sides based upon viewpoints. So that's the second and a very important bedrock principle. A third one is content discrimination is disfavored. So what that means is not as strong as viewpoint discrimination is illegal, but rather, in general, the government should not be favoring certain content over other content. But again, that's just more of a general principle, and there are many exceptions to that. One easy one to understand is the government includes public schools, and in public schools, it's certainly allowed under the First Amendment for, say, public school teachers to say certain content of speech is going to be off limits for age-appropriate reasons. For younger students, they just shouldn't be exposed to certain types of very adult speech, and so it's okay for the government to say, in this case, public school teachers, to say, that whole area of speech we're just going to put off limits. And then the last thing I would mention is I think it's very helpful when thinking about free speech matters to think in terms of 4 different variables. If with any free speech question that someone encounters, they stop and ask themselves these 4 questions, I think it's super helpful, gives a lot of analytic insight. So first, who's the speaker? Who is the one that is doing the speaking? Second, what is the speech? What is the person trying to say? Third, who's the government actor that is restricting the speech, limiting the speech, affecting the speech? And then fourth, what is the government restriction? So again, speaker, speech, government actor, government restriction. If you pause and think about any speech event with those 4 characteristics in mind, it helps bring some clarity as to how a court is going to analyze that under the free speech clause.
Getting back to the content discrimination, can you give an example of something that a teacher might prohibit because of the age of her students that would be protected under the First Amendment?
Sure, I can give an example. So again, say a second grade teacher would be allowed under this idea of content restrictions are generally disfavored, but sometimes allowed. A second grade teacher would be allowed to say, you know what, we're not going to have my second grade students talk about very difficult adult issues like what happened in the Holocaust, how many people were killed, who was responsible, or issues of sexuality, just difficult adult issues of, whose sexuality is favored, disfavored, what's right, what's wrong in those contexts. If some second grader came in and said, oh, Miss Smith, I really want to talk about these things during, discussion time in our, second grade circle, the teacher could say, you know what, we're not going to do that. We're just going to take all that content, which is just not age appropriate, and we're going to put it to the side. And if that second grade second grade student's parents said, oh my gosh, my school, this teacher is violating my daughter's First Amendment rights by refusing to allow this content to be discussed, courts would say, no, actually, this is an example of where a content restriction is allowed. Different from, say, if the government, say the city of Fort Collins, said, oh, we're going to put in some sort of content restriction to forbid people in a public park from speaking about certain topics because we think certain topics are just too hot right now in our society. That would almost certainly be struck down as a violation of the First Amendment, of the Free Speech Clause, because it would be the government of Fort Collins trying to limit the adults from the ability to speak about certain content. And yeah, that be an example of a content restriction that would violate the free speech clause.
So how do you answer the question of, can anyone say anything about anything or anyone, and have that be protected under freedom of speech?
No is the short answer to that. No, the free speech clause does not allow anyone to say anything at any time. I would go back to remind everybody of the first principle I talked about, which is the free speech clause restricts the government from limiting the people's ability to speak. So, for instance, it doesn't affect how private entities can restrict people's ability to speak. So in your private workplace, if you work for a private entity, that's your employer, then your private employer has a lot of latitude as to what you say in your workplace, and the First Amendment has nothing to say about that. The First Amendment has limits, and it doesn't apply in all circumstances like your question, presupposed.
Does that include protecting false statements or lies, intentional or otherwise?
So that's a great question, and I think it's helpful to answer it by going back to that framework of the 4 different factors you should think of. So let's take the U.S. versus Alvarez case as an example. That's the Stolen Valor Act case. And in that case, it was, okay, there were certain people who were speaking, right? So who are they? They're the speakers who were speaking. What were they speaking about? Their speech was about how they had won some sort of military honor or served in military service in some way, but they were lying, right? So their speech was false. The speaker was just some person who was speaking these falsehoods. That's the speaker in the speech. And then what was the government actor? It was Congress. Congress had passed this law, the Stolen Valor Act, that I believe criminalized people, again, stealing the valor of military heroes by lying about their military service. And so the government actor was Congress. And then what was the restriction on speech? It was the Stolen Valor Act, saying you cannot, again, steal other people's valor. And the Supreme Court in U.S. versus Alvarez struck that down and said, no, the free speech clause allows people to lie about their military service that they didn't have, because again, our free speech clause is supposed to allow for wide latitudes to speak, including in that context the ability to lie about things. I mean, that to me, Megan, brings up another important free speech principle, which is under our free speech clause, we allow for what most reasonable people would think is despicable speech, wrong speech, immoral speech. And I think a lot of people, myself included, would say, yeah, lying about your military service is immoral, it's wrong, people shouldn't do it. And yet the free speech clause allows for it. Another example is despicable speech that's hateful, that's hurtful, that none of us would want to be subjected to, but it's still protected under the free speech clause. Classic example is when the Nazi Party, requested a permission to march through Skokie, Illinois, if I have that right, which was had a large Jewish population. And they wanted, again, to get some sort of parade permit to have this march, which was very hurtful, painful, awful speech, especially for the citizens of that particular community. And yet it was allowed under the free speech clause. That sort of hurtful speech is allowed because the free speech clause wants speech to flourish. And the Supreme Court has said again and again, the antidote to hateful speech like that is counter speech. It's other people speaking. It's not, let's not let the Nazis march, but rather it's let's the Nazis march. They can have their speech, but then let's have other people speak up and say, well, here's why I think that speech or that demonstration is wrong. And keep in mind, the free speech clause covers oral speech, covers written speech, and also covers certain actions, expressive activities like marching or like burning a flag, right? You might have heard about the flag burning case from a couple of years ago gosh, I forget, what, 15 maybe years ago now, where the question was, could the government criminalize, punish people for burning the United States flag? And the Supreme Court said they couldn't. The government couldn't criminalize that, couldn't punish it, because the action of burning a flag was expressive conduct. It was symbolic, expressive conduct that the free speech clause protects and doesn't allow the government to criminalize it.
Yes, and if you want to learn more about flag burning and its legal status in American history, you can watch a previous Just the Facts, Ma'am episode that's listed as Flag Etiquette. Okay, so broad latitude, a lot of freedom protected with freedom of speech in the First Amendment, but it's not carte blanche. It doesn't protect everything, right? And so what are some exceptions? What is some unprotected speech examples?
Defamation is a common one. So you cannot defame someone. Defamation is both libel and slander. Libel is written defamation. Slander is oral defamation. And what defamation means is you cannot say something that is objectively false about someone else that would hurt their reputation. So the easy example is that I use all the time when explaining defamation is if someone said about me, "Oh, Eric, you're a terrible lawyer." Okay, that's not defamation. Why? Because it's not objectively false. It's their opinion. It's their opinion about me. It might hurt my reputation. I might not like it, but it's an opinion statement. However, if someone said rather, "Oh, Eric, you've been disbarred. You don't have a law license in Colorado," that is objectively false. I could prove that to be false, and that would hurt my reputation, especially in legal circles. And so I could sue them for defamation. So you can't, the First Amendment would not protect them from making those defamatory statements. Other examples, fighting words. So you can't go up to someone and incite a fight, get in their face and say nasty, hurtful things, which any reasonable person would make them so angry that they would fight you, right? First Amendment does not protect that. Similarly, you cannot incite imminent violence. So you can't say things which would incite a group to engage in like imminent violence. So you can't say go to the city hall and get a crowd around you and say things that's really going to whip up that crowd into saying, "Oh, let's burn down City Hall right now," or "Let's go smash the windows of City Hall like right now in this moment." So the First Amendment wouldn't allow that. But again, those are very narrow exceptions. How about harassing speech? The First Amendment doesn't allow for harassing speech, which is why things like Title VII, law enacted by Congress, allows Congress to say that people can be punished for saying sexually harassing statements to their colleagues at work. And the Free Speech Clause doesn't protect that sort of harassing speech. And there's a whole number of other categories of essentially exceptions to free speech. And then again, some of them, when you think about them, are just pure exceptions, and some of them are where the court will balance, okay, well, the speech might be covered by the Free Speech Clause, but it's not going to be protected in the sense that the government is going to be allowed to regulate it. So those are some examples of kind of the exceptions to free speech protections.
Going back to the bedrock principle about the First Amendment is protecting people from abridged speech by the government. And then you touched on previously, and could you expand on whether employers can control or abridge employees' speech?
So yes, employers can control employees' speech. And let's break it into two areas. First, private employers, and then public employers. So the easy one is private employers, because again, private employers can control their employees' speech because they're not the government. Again, the Free Speech Clause applies to the government. It doesn't apply to private actors like a private employer restricting their employees' speech. So that's an easy one. But even in the public employment context, can a public employer restrict their public employees' speech? Yes, is the answer to that. It depends on the context. The First Amendment does apply there, but the Supreme Court has held in numerous different cases saying that public employers have latitude to protect or to control their employees' speech about the speech about the work that they are doing as employees, not the speech that they might have as a citizen or just as a member of the public, but the speech that they engage in when they're working in their public employee job. Can their public employer control that speech? Generally, yes.
So, all really helpful and interesting and certainly relevant. We hear about freedom of speech and the First Amendment all the time. And so, in summary, is it fair to say that it is a protection of individual liberties of people, regardless of citizen status within any U.S. jurisdiction, from censorship or retribution by the government of most forms of speech, but not all? So it's not a carte blanche protection. There are exceptions, and which means that there's unprotected speech, which you went over. And then you gave us a framework of how to apply the four elements of that to evaluate when and how freedom of speech is a protection. Is there anything that I've missed or that you would like to add?
Yeah, that's a great summary. Another way to think about it is time, place, and manner restrictions. So time, place, and manner restrictions are common in the speech context, and it's helpful to think about a person giving a certain sort of speech and then applying that through the framework of time, place, and manner. So let's say the question is, can I speak about some hot button issue in our culture by getting a soapbox and standing on my soapbox and getting a microphone and speaking through my microphone about this issue that I'm passionate about, right? So then the question would be, okay, well, where could I do that? Could I go do that in a park in Fort Collins in the middle of the day, even if it made some people in that park uncomfortable or some people were disappointed because they were wanting to have a private picnic or whatever? The answer to that is yes, I could. The free speech clause would protect me, and the government of Fort Collins couldn't pass some sort of regulation saying, oh, Eric, you cannot speak about that hot button issue in our park. Okay, but could I, let's change the facts a little bit. Let's change the time. Could I do that instead of the middle of the day? Could I do that at 2 a.m? And could I do that in my car as I'm driving around one neighborhood in the morning? One neighborhood after another? The answer to that is no. The city of Fort Collins could pass regulations saying, you know what, after a certain hour of the day, let's say after 10 o'clock at night or between 10 o'clock and 6 a.m, we're going to limit the ability of anyone to have any sort of loud speech or music or anything. Because why? Because people are sleeping, and we want people in neighborhoods to be able to sleep. So that would be an example of, oh, okay, in that case, the government could limit my ability to speak through a microphone at 2 a.m. Okay, well, let's change it again. Let's say instead of being an adult in a park, I'm a 5th grade student in a public school. Could I, during history class, stand up with my microphone and start speaking about some hot button issue? Or could my 5th grade teacher tell me, hey, Eric, sit down. This is class, and we're not talking about that right now. She could, right? Because that's another example of, in that context, in that place, this is not a time for free speech. This is a time for learning the classroom material that the teacher is trying to teach to all her 5th grade students, including me as another 5th grade student. So again, you change the time and the place, and then the manner of the restriction. Could the government of Fort Collins say, we're going to allow private owners to, eject people who are going around with their microphones speaking about a hot button issue in their coffee shops or in their movie theaters or in their restaurants? yes, the city of Fort Collins could do that because that's protecting the ability of private owners to run their businesses and not be disrupted by someone who wants to, speak through their microphone. So again, the time, place, and manner examples help people think about how, context matters, and speech is going to be treated differently depending on when it's given, where it's given, who it's given by, and the government actors wanting to restrict it.
All right, that's all we have for today. As always, the links to references and the most updated price trends of milk, gas, and eggs are included in the document below. Thanks very much for being here, Eric. It's always a pleasure to spend time with you, and I appreciate your expertise shared with me and my viewers today.
Happy to do it. It's great to be here. Thanks.
See you next time.